The Awakening of the Gods. Chapter 1. The Awakening of Shadows. The night in Whisperwood was filled with an unnatural silence. No wind stirred the dense treetops, no sound came from the depths of the forest. It was as if the world was holding its breath, a deceptive calm that weighed heavily on the shoulders of those who dared to cross this forbidden boundary. In the heart of the forest, where the ancient roots of oaks clawed out of the ground like talons, a young girl knelt. Her dirt-smeared hands trembled as she clutched a dusty amulet. The artifact was unassuming, a simple crystal set in weathered silver, but its touch burned her skin like hot coals. It was a mistake to take it, whispered a voice in her mind, but curiosity and desperation had long since overwhelmed her. A distant rumble broke the silence. The ground beneath her feet quaked, and a cold breeze swept through the forest, as if someone had opened an invisible door. Shadows began to coil around her, first like harmless wisps of fog, then growing denser until they took on shapes. Eyes glinted from the darkness, unnaturally luminous, and voices, a chorus of whispers and screams, filled the air. "The heart of world," they murmured. The girl wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The shadows tugged at her clothes, at her mind. In her panic, she dropped the amulet, and the moment it touched the ground, the world tore apart. A blinding light exploded from the artifact, illuminating the entire forest. The shadows retreated, but the light brought no salvation. Instead, it tore a hole in reality itself, a shimmering rift pulsating with energy. Through it, one could see a strange world, one of floating islands, glowing plants, and shapes that defied comprehension. The girl felt the magic of the rift coursing through her, as if a part of her was becoming one with it. Her last clear memory was the voice that whispered, "You have opened the gates. The fate of both worlds now lies in your hands." Then there was nothing but darkness. Chapter 2. An ordinary day in the shadow of the unknown. The morning sun broke through the torn clouds, casting long golden shadows over the sleepy village of Eldon Hall. The streets were paved with worn stones, smoothed by generations of footsteps. Everywhere, a cozy yet weary calm prevailed. Life here moved slowly, at a pace that seemed unchanging. For Cale, the 16-year-old stable boy, this was anything but comforting. He felt as though he was suffocating here. Eldon Hall was too small, too predictable, a collection of rooftops and faces that all seemed the same. But today, on this seemingly ordinary day, he had a strange feeling that something was in the air, something undefinable that had clung to him all morning. Cale tightened the straps on the saddle he was fastening to the unruly horse, Briss muttering curses under his breath. "Hold still, you dumb beast!" The horse snorted indifferently, stomping its hooves. "You won't convince him with words," came a familiar voice behind him. It was Illa, his best friend, a year older, smarter, and, as she often claimed, hopelessly too curious. She tossed him an apple, which he barely caught before it hit the ground. "Thanks," Cale muttered, biting into the apple as he watched her out of the corner of his eye. Illa had that rare talent for finding adventure even in the dullest places. "Do you know what I heard?" she said, leaning against the wooden stable wall and lowering her voice dramatically. "Someone was seen in Whisperwood last night." Cale froze. In Whisperwood? Who would be that stupid? Who knows? But apparently people heard screams. The elders are saying it's the curse of the shadows stirring again. She grinned, but her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. Cale opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a sound broke through the stables, a low, rhythmic thudding coming from outside. The earth beneath his feet vibrated slightly. "What was that?" he asked, but Illa barely heard him. She was already at the door, peering out. Reluctantly, Cale followed. Outside, small groups of villagers had gathered, their faces filled with worry. Over the hills, In the direction of Whisperwood, a faint, strange glow hung in the air, tinting the sky. It wasn't the warm orange of the sun or the silver shimmer of the moon. It was a cold, pulsating blue, almost painful to look at. That is not normal, Illa whispered, and Kale silently nodded. A voice called out from the crowd. The shadows are coming! An old man, hunched and trembling, pointed with a gnarled finger toward the forest. Kale felt his heart begin to race. Something had begun. Something far greater than all of them. Chapter 3. The Shadows Beckon. The path to the Whispering Woods was steep and rocky, flanked by gnarled trees whose branches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. Kale could feel the cold radiating from the shadows of the trees, even though the sun still hung in the sky. Beside him, Illa walked with determined strides, her face a mix of resolve and faint apprehension. Why are we doing this again? Kale asked, kicking a loose stone aside. Because you know we'd regret it if we didn't, Illa replied without looking at him. Kale scoffed. Or we'll regret it because we'll end up dead. Oh, and now you're the pessimist? She flashed him a quick grin, though her eyes stayed vigilant. The blue glow they'd seen from the village was still there, stronger now, emanating from a clearing deep in the heart of the woods, a place even bravest hunters avoided. When they reached the forest's edge, Kale stopped. His breath formed small clouds in the chilly air, and a strange tingling sensation crept over his skin. Do you feel that? Illa nodded slowly. It feels like a storm is brewing. Together they stepped into the forest. The sounds of the outside world, birdsong, the hum of insects vanished instantly. Instead, there was only an eerie silence, broken occasionally by the rustling of leaves, though no wind stirred the air. The deeper they went, the stranger the surroundings became. The trees seemed taller, their shadows longer, and the blue glow filtering through the branches made the world look surreal. Finally, they reached the clearing. In the center lay a crater, deep and unnaturally round, as if a massive fist had punched the earth. At its center floated the artifact, the amulet from the prologue. It was no larger than a hand, yet it pulsed with a power that drove Kale to his knees. This can't be real, Illa murmured, her voice barely audible. Kale felt something pulling at him, not physically, but at his thoughts, his very being. It's calling me, he said, not knowing why. Kale, wait! Illa grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. Something or someone wanted him closer. With hesitant steps, he entered the crater. The moment his fingers brushed the artifact, the world shattered. A deafening crack split the air, and a surge of blue energy erupted in every direction. Kale was thrown backward, but before he hit the ground, he saw something, a vision, an image burned into his mind. He saw two worlds, linked by a fragile thread. He saw creatures emerging from the shadows, their eyes blazing with hunger, and he saw himself, or what seemed to be him. This version wore armor, surrounded by an aura that both protected and consumed him. Then there was only darkness. Chapter 4. The Voice of the Shadows. Kale awoke with a gasp, his chest rising and falling as though he'd run for miles. He lay flat on his back, surrounded by debris and trampled grass. The clearing was no longer the same. The blue glow had vanished, replaced by an oppressive darkness that seemed to creep into his bones. Illa knelt beside him, her hands gripping his shoulders. Kale, say something. Are you okay? He blinked at her, his head pounding. I don't know. His voice sounded foreign, even to himself. You touched the artifact. Are you insane? Her tone was a mix of panic and relief. Kale tried to answer, but another voice, cold and alien, echoed in his mind. You have chosen, mortal. The shadows are now a part of you. He flinched, his breath catching. Did you hear that? he asked frantically. Hear what? Illa frowned. Cale, you're not okay. We need to get out of here. Before she could pull him to his feet, the air around them began to vibrate. A whispering sound, like hundreds of voices murmuring at once, filled the clearing. The shadows at the forest's edge began to move, writhing and twisting like living things. What is that? Illa stepped back, her face pale. Cale forced himself upright, his limbs heavy as lead. He felt a strange energy coursing through him, something that both frightened and empowered him. Stay behind me, he said, his voice deeper, almost commanding. The shadows coalesced into a shape tall, with glowing eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. The creature spoke, but its words pierced directly into Cale's mind. You have disturbed the balance. The realm of shadows will now claim its due. Cale felt a wave of panic wash over him, but alongside it was something else, a spark, burning within him. The visions he'd seen, the image of himself in armor, returned. I don't know what you are, he said aloud, but I won't let you hurt us. A guttural laugh emanated from the creature, and it lunged at him, but before it could reach him, something unexpected happened. Cale's hands glowed with a faint blue light, and an invisible barrier erupted in front of him. The creature struck it and recoiled, hissing before dissolving into smoke. Illa stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. What? What was that? And what did you just do? Cale breathed heavily, his hands trembling as the blue light faded. I have no idea, he whispered, but I think this is just the beginning. Chapter 5. The Legacy of the Whispering Forest. The night had wrapped Eldenhall in impenetrable darkness. The village was silent, eerily so. Cale and Illa had made it back, but their return brought more questions than answers. Cale sat in the attic of his house, the artifact before him on a small wooden table. It looked different now, fainter, almost lifeless. Yet he could still feel it whispering in his mind, an echo of the words he had heard in the forest. What exactly did you do, Cale? Illa stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her eyes filled with worry. I don't know. Cale's voice was rough, almost hoarse. I didn't even touch it because I wanted to. It called me. That's not an answer. Illa stepped closer, sitting across from him, eyeing the artifact with suspicion. We need to find someone who knows what this is, someone who understands magic. Cale looked up. And who would that be? Here in Eldenhall? The only wise ones here are the elders, who tell us stories about the curse, but nothing concrete. Illa thought for a moment, then lifted her head. There is someone. Not here, but in the Valley of Dran. The hermit there. They say he was once a great mage. Cale frowned. You mean that madman? No one's seen him in years. If he's still alive, he might help us. Or would you rather sit here and wait for those shadows to return? Cale closed his eyes. The memory of the creature wouldn't let him rest. The feeling of darkness threatening to consume him, and the power that had surged from within, it was more than he could comprehend. Fine, he said at last. We leave at first light. The next morning. The journey to the Valley of Dran was long and perilous. They had to navigate through mountains filled with cliffs, narrow trails, and rumors of bandits. But when they reached the valley, they found something unexpected. The hermit, a frail man with deep, piercing eyes, was already waiting for them outside his hut. I saw you coming, he said, his voice crackling like fire. And I know what you carry. Cale stared at him. How? The shadows have spies everywhere, boy. The hermit gestured to the artifact. And this thing? It's older than the two of you combined. You've awakened something that should have stayed undisturbed. Chapter 6. Hunters of the Dark. The morning was cool. a heavy mist clinging to the air as Kale and Illa left the forest. The hermit had given them a rough map showing the way to the halls of Lyria, but they knew this was only the first step. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Illa asked, pulling her cloak tighter around her. Kale nodded, though he doubted himself. "If we stay here, the village won't be safe. Besides, I need to know what all of this means." The first hours of their journey were quiet, but the further they went, the heavier the atmosphere became. The mist seemed thicker, and the sounds of the forest faded away. "Something's not right," Illa whispered, her eyes scanning their surroundings. Kale felt it too, a strange tingling, as if the air itself was alive with tension. Then they heard it, a faint rustling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Run!" Kale shouted, grabbing Illa's arm as they bolted. The shadows moved swiftly, like living tendrils of fog closing in around them. Kale's heart raced, but something within him stirred, the same power that had saved him on the clearing. "Illa, go!" he yelled, stopping and turning to face the darkness. He raised his hands, and the blue glow returned, brighter than before. A barrier expanded around him, repelling the shadows. But there were too many, and Kale felt his energy draining. The shadows hissed and circled him, their forms becoming more tangible. "Kale!" Illa screamed, but before she could run back, a brilliant beam of light cut through the darkness. A figure emerged, clad in silver armor, wielding a sword that radiated pure magic. With swift, precise movements, the stranger struck down the shadows until only silence remained. Kale fell to his knees, his breathing labored. Who are you?" The stranger turned, their face hidden beneath a hood. "A guardian," they said simply, "and you're on the path that will either save you or destroy you." Chapter 7. A Guardian of Forgotten Times. The guardian stood motionless, his silver armor gleaming faintly in the morning light. The shadows surrounding him seemed to dissolve as he turned to Kale and Illa. "You've jeopardized the veil. You've unleashed the darkness," he said with a calm but urgent voice. "But it's not too late. You must learn what you have just set free." "We did what we had to. We didn't mean to endanger anyone," Kale said, still breathless from the brief yet intense encounter with the shadows. The guardian shook his head. "This was no simple decision. You've tampered with forces beyond your understanding." He stepped closer, sitting on a fallen log. "You call yourselves keepers of the veil, but do you even know what that truly means?" Illa raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" "You are the last of an ancient lineage," the guardian said, nodding toward the artifact. "Kale, you carry the legacy of the keepers within you. Your presence here is no coincidence, nor is your connection to each other. There is a reason the artifact called to you." Kale stared at him. "You said I endangered the veil. What happens now?" The guardian tilted his head slightly, his eyes flickering with a moment of pity. "It will only get worse. The shadows are just the beginning. The real danger lies in the breaking of the barrier between worlds. If the veil isn't restored, what lurks in the darkness will consume this world." "What can we do?" Illa asked, her concern barely hidden. "There is a way to renew the veil," the guardian said, "but it requires more than just magic. It will demand a journey to the halls of Lyria, and those halls are not a safe place." "What's there?" Kale asked, already feeling the weight of the journey ahead. "The knowledge you seek, but also the source of the darkness. Only those who uncover the secret of the halls can restore the barrier." The guardian rose and extended his sword to Kale. "This is a relic of the keepers, a symbol of power and responsibility. Take it and go with the knowledge that the fate of this world rests in your hands." Kale grasped the sword, surprised by how light it felt. "And what will you do?" "I will accompany you for a time, but your journey will eventually continue without me. You will find the halls, but the true test awaits there. Chapter 8. Through the Mist. The Guardian led Kale and Illa through a labyrinth of paths that grew narrower and more tangled with every step. The mist surrounding them was unnaturally thick, seeming to shift and move with a will of its own. "Stay close to me," the Guardian warned, raising his sword, which glowed like a beacon in the darkness. "This is no ordinary mist. It has a consciousness, and it dislikes intruders." Kale glanced back, but could barely see 10 paces behind him. "What happens if we get separated?" "You don't want to find out," the Guardian replied tersely. The group moved slowly, every step feeling heavier, as if the ground itself resisted their passage. Whispers echoed through the mist, soft voices calling Kale's name. "Do you hear that?" he asked, and Illa nodded nervously. "It's trying to lure you," the Guardian explained. "Ignore it. The mist is a guardian of the darkness seeking cracks in your mind." Kale focused on keeping the glow of the Guardian's sword in sight, but the whispers grew louder. "Kale, help us. Why did you leave us?" He froze. It was his mother's voice. "No," he muttered, clenching his fists. "That's not real." But the whispers turned into a chorus, threatening to overwhelm him. Illa grabbed his hand. "Kale, don't listen. Stay with us." The Guardian turned sharply, his voice like a blade. "Kale, run!" Kale felt the ground beneath him give way, as if the mist sought to swallow him whole. With a final surge of will, he tore himself away from the voices and sprinted toward the light. The mist seemed to scream before it abruptly dissipated. They stumbled onto a clearing, breathless and drained. The Guardian nodded. "You've passed the first test, but this was only a taste of what's to come." "That was a test?" Illa asked, horrified. "It nearly killed us." "The halls of Lyria will not forgive mistakes," the Guardian said. "You must learn to conquer your inner demons, or you will fail." Chapter 9. Whispering Shadows. The clearing where they stood felt like a moment of calm, yet Kale could sense the tension in the air. The Guardian had turned away, tracing symbols in the ground with the tip of his sword. "What are you doing?" Illa asked cautiously. "Protection," the Guardian replied curtly. "We're too close to the halls. The shadows grow more aggressive." Kale stepped closer, his eyes drawn to the symbols, which glowed faintly as they were drawn. "What are these shadows? Why are they following us?" The Guardian lifted his head, his expression serious. "The shadows are what's left of those who failed. They aren't ghosts. They're echoes of despair, greed, and pain. They seek to destroy you to regain their existence." "Wonderful," Illa muttered. "So not only do we have to save the veil, but we also have to run from living nightmares." Kale gave a faint smile, but his unease remained. "How far are we from the halls?" "Not far," the Guardian said, gesturing toward the dense forest ahead. "But the final stretch will be the most dangerous. The halls are protected by a barrier that only allows those who are ready to accept their truth." Kale frowned. "My truth?" "You'll understand when the time comes," the Guardian said, raising a hand to urge the group onward. They continued, the air growing colder and the shadows deeper. Kale felt his thoughts grow heavier, as if something was sifting through his memories. Suddenly, the light from the Guardian's sword flickered, and the darkness around them seemed to shift. "Stop," the Guardian commanded, raising his sword. "They're here." The shadows coalesced into figures, their faces blurred yet painfully familiar. Kale caught glimpses of his father's face, then that of an old friend. "Kale, you abandoned us. Why?" The voices of the shadows were a chorus of guilt and sorrow. Illa screamed as one of the figures advanced on her, but the Guardian swung his sword and a flash of light dispelled the darkness. "Oh, you must stay strong," the Guardian Guardian shouted, "They attack your weaknesses!" Kale squinted, pushing the voices in his head aside and focusing on the glow of the sword. "We'll get through this," he told himself, taking a step forward. The shadows recoiled, hissing like tormented souls, but they didn't retreat fully. Kale felt an unfamiliar power awaken within him. His hands began to glow, and a surge of energy burst forth, scattering the shadows. The Guardian looked at him with a hint of pride. "You're learning fast, Keeper." Chapter 10. The Gates of Lyria. Before them rose a massive door, its surface shimmering like molten silver and shifting in endless patterns. The halls of Lyria lay hidden beyond this boundary, and Kale felt as though he stood on the edge of something immeasurable. "Are these the halls?" Illa asked, her voice a mix of awe and fear. The Guardian nodded. "The halls of Lyria. But not everyone may enter. They will test you before you can step inside." Kale approached the door, which seemed to change with every step. Faces and symbols appeared and vanished as if whispering, "How will we be tested?" The Guardian crossed his arms. "The halls look into your soul. They see your strengths and your darkness. What you face will be unique, and there will be no second chance." Illa placed a hand on Kale's shoulder. "Are you ready?" He nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. "We don't have a choice." The Guardian stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "It's time. Touch the door, and the trial will begin." Kale and Illa exchanged a brief glance before Kale stepped forward and placed his hand on the cold, shifting surface. A flash of light engulfed him, and he felt himself being pulled into the depths. Kale's trial. Kale found himself in a space that felt otherworldly. The walls were made of floating fragments of memories, scenes from his childhood, moments of loss and joy. Yet each memory felt distorted, as though recounted by someone else. A voice echoed, calm yet powerful. "Kale, bearer of the sword? Who are you truly? What do you hide?" Suddenly a figure appeared before him. It was himself, but darker, harder. "You're weak," the figure said with a bitter smile. "You think you can save the world, but you can't even accept your own failures." Kale clenched his fists. "I know who I am. I've made mistakes, but I won't let them define me." The dark figure laughed, raising a sword that mirrored Kale's own. "Then prove it!" A battle erupted, but it was more than just physical. Kale felt each movement test the limits of his willpower. Every strike forced him to confront his fears, the loss of his family, the weight of responsibility, and the possibility of failure. Illa's trial. Illa found herself in an endless forest where the trees whispered incessantly. The voices carried accusations and doubts. "You are worthless," the trees murmured. "You're nothing but a burden." Illa shook her head firmly. "That's not true. I've always fought for what I believe in." Yet the voices grew louder, nearly overwhelming her thoughts. She saw a figure emerging from the mist, her mother, who had abandoned her long ago. "Why did you forget me?" the figure asked, tears in her eyes. "I never forgot you," Illa whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I had to find my own path." With each step through the forest, Illa began to realize that she didn't have to fight the voices. She had to accept them. Back at the door, Kale and Illa awoke simultaneously in front of the door. Both appeared exhausted, but something about them had changed. They seemed stronger, more focused. The Guardian examined them with a scrutinizing gaze. "You've passed, but the real trials begin now." The door slowly opened, revealing the halls of Lyria, an endless library filled with secrets and peril. Chapter 11. The Knowledge of the Ancients. Kale and Illa stood at the entrance of the halls of Lyria. An infinite labyrinth of shelves and scrolls stretched before them. The space seemed boundless, filled with an almost deafening silence that carried immense weight. "This is where the world's knowledge is sealed," said the guardian, who appeared behind them. "Every answer you seek lies here, but not all are prepared for the truth." Cale stepped cautiously forward, feeling the presence of power and danger saturating the air. "How do we find what we need?" "The halls seek you," the guardian replied. "You will be guided by what you fear the most." "What we fear?" Illa raised an eyebrow. "Sounds delightful." "Every choice you make here will change you," the guardian warned, his voice now grave. "What you seek won't come easily. You must be ready to sacrifice what is most dear to you." The air in the hall grew heavier. Cale could feel an unfamiliar energy tugging at him, reminiscent of the hidden depths of the veil, something he didn't fully understand yet. "So, we must sacrifice something?" Cale asked. "What if we're not ready?" "Then you'll die here." The guardian gestured toward a cluster of ancient dark doors hidden deep within the hall. "Through those doors lies the true path, but the price you'll pay may destroy you." Illa placed a reassuring hand on Cale's shoulder. "I'm ready if you are." Cale met her gaze. "We have no choice. If we want to save the veil, we can't hesitate." Together they ventured into the shadowy halls, lined with golden inscriptions that shifted before their eyes. They heard whispers, an unintelligible murmuring echoing from the depths of the hall like ghostly fragments of the past. Cale's trial in the halls. Cale followed the light of the guardian's sword and found himself before a massive stone wall. It was covered with ancient runes and symbols, pulsating in a rhythmic glow. In the center of the wall was a window, or rather, a mirror reflecting the image of his past. He stepped closer and recognized the faces of his family, the ones he'd seen countless times in the mist of darkness. But this time, it was different. They weren't just ghosts of the past. They stared at him with reproach. "Why did you leave us?" asked the vision of his mother. "Why did you place yourself above us?" Cale took a step back, but the image of his family pulled him in relentlessly. I never wanted to abandon you, but I had to look forward. I couldn't live in the past." "And what have you found?" asked the shadow of his father. "Have you truly earned what you sought?" The questions pierced deep into Cale's soul, and he felt the darkness within him rising, but he knew that this was not the way. "I have made mistakes," he said firmly, "but I will not let them destroy me. I move forward for you and for everyone yet to come." With renewed resolve, he stepped into the mirror and found himself in a new chamber, free from the shadows of his past. Illa's trial in the halls. Illa found herself in a room surrounded by countless mirrors. In each mirror she saw herself, but in every reflection she was different, sometimes weak and vulnerable, sometimes strong and determined, sometimes consumed by doubt, sometimes with a clear and unshakable vision. "Who are you really?" asked a voice from the mirrors. "What do you want from yourself?" Illa could feel her own fears manifesting in these distorted reflections. I am Illa," she whispered. "It took me a long time to understand what that means, but now I know that I hold control over my own life." The mirrors began to shatter, one by one, and Illa felt lighter, as though she had finally shed the chains of her doubts. Reunion in the hall. Cale and Illa found themselves back at the entrance of the halls, their trials completed and their resolve strengthened. The guardian approached them and nodded. "The halls of Lyria are not a place of knowledge but of realization," he said. "What you now hold in your hands is the knowledge that can destroy everything or nothing." "What are we waiting for?" Cale asked, unwilling to hesitate any longer. "Let's move forward." The guardian nodded and opened another door, leading deeper into the halls. The truth they sought lay beyond that door. Chapter 12. The Curse of Truth. Kale and Illa stood before a new door, which opened as though they had only touched it, not pushed. The room beyond was engulfed in a paralyzing silence, a silence that weighed heavily on their hearts. The halls of Lyria had begun their true test. "This is it," Kale whispered, the air suddenly heavier as he stepped across the threshold. "This is what we were searching for." "And what exactly were we searching for?" Illa asked, though she already knew. The answer flickered within her. It was not just a matter of knowledge. It was the beginning of an unstoppable chain reaction. Knowledge that could bring destruction. The Guardian stepped behind them, his presence almost a physical weight as he spoke. "The knowledge you find here is not what you expect. It will pierce through you and make you into what you truly are deep inside. You are no longer the same as you were at the start of this journey, and not all of you will reach the end." "What do you mean by that?" Kale turned abruptly, his voice sharp. "Did you lead us here just to break us?" "There is always a price for true knowledge," the Guardian replied, his voice impenetrable. "It demands more than courage and determination. It demands the soul." With a gaze as deep and unfathomable as the room itself, the Guardian stepped toward the massive rune-carved tablet at the center of the room. Kale and Illa followed. The tablet vibrated under their gaze. It was more than an artifact. It was a door to an immense truth they would not only see but feel. "Anyone who seeks knowledge must face the curse that comes with it," the Guardian said. "Look and see." Kale's decision. Kale stepped forward and touched the tablet with a trembling hand. The moment his hand made contact with the stone, it felt like a punch to the stomach. He could feel the room around him shatter as if it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. The space around him suddenly wasn't the same. It was as if his own soul was being pulled into the room. Before him, images appeared, memories that were not his, scenes from a past time. He saw himself as a child, but the childhood he knew was not the one he saw. These memories were different, distorted, a life he had never lived, a life that had been hidden from him. "What is this?" Kale murmured as the visions overwhelmed his senses. "It is the curse of truth," said the voice of the Guardian. "What you see is the price of knowledge. You see not only what was, but also what could be. And what you see is just the beginning. What you recognize in this vision will change your life. But be careful, Kale. Sometimes it's better not to know everything." Kale fought against the visions, but they grew stronger. He saw the image of a destroyed world rise before him, a world in which he was one of the leading forces, but not on the side of the good. This version of him had embraced the dark legacy that had followed him for so long. A decision he had made back then had led the world down a dangerous path. "No," he gasped, shaking his head. That's not my way." "You have already chosen the path, Kale," whispered the voice of the Guardian. "Every step you've taken has led to this moment, and now you will see how it ends." Kale's body trembled as he struggled with all his might to break the vision, but then he realized it. The truth was not just the memory of what was, it was also the burden of what was yet to come. This decision, this struggle, was not just a test of his strength. It was the fight against what he found within himself. He ripped his hand from the tablet and stepped back, breathing heavily, his heart pounding wildly. "Illa's decision?" Illa stepped forward as well, her hands trembling. She knew what would come. She had felt it when Kale touched the tablet. Her own doubts and fears rose like a powerful storm. She placed her hands on the cold stone, and the image of her own future appeared before her eyes. But it was not the future she had hoped for. She saw herself as a queen, but the crown on her head was not made of gold, it was made of thorn. Her kingdom was marked by war and destruction, and the people she ruled did not see her as a savior, but as a cruel tyrant. It was an image she had never wished for herself. "No," she cried as the vision grew stronger. This is not me. The answer didn't come from the tablet, but from the dark voice of the halls themselves, sinking deep into her being. You are everything you fear and more. What you could become is only a step away, but be careful what you choose, for the curse of truth is not just a glimpse of the future, it is a mirror of your soul. Illa pulled her hand back as the vision nearly consumed her. Her legs gave way and she collapsed to the ground, gasping, "This can't be. I can't let this happen." "Each of you carries darkness within," said the guardian. "The truth is not what you want to hear, but what you need to know in order to save the world, and not all of you will survive this journey." The guardian speaks. The guardian stepped forward as Kale and Illa stepped away from the tablet, their faces marked by horror and pain. The halls of Lyria show only what the bearer of truth can endure. You've seen the knowledge now, you must decide what to do with it. "And what if we're not strong enough?" Illa asked in a weak voice. "Then the curse will destroy the world, and you won't live to see the end," the guardian replied with a grim look. Chapter 13. The Decision of Fate. Kale and Illa stood now at the edge of the abyss. The halls of Lyria, once a place of wisdom and guidance, had transformed into a labyrinth of distorted mirrors and shimmering visions. Their path was clear, but the price they had to pay was becoming increasingly evident. "Kale," Illa said quietly, her voice as calm as the wind that swept through the empty halls. "What if what we've seen isn't just our past or future? What if it's the price for knowing what is to come?" I don't know," Kale murmured, his gaze fixed on the dark gates ahead. "But what I do know is that we can't stay here. If we linger, the knowledge will break us. We must move on." Illa nodded, but the doubt was deep in her eye. She couldn't shake the darkness that had settled in her heart. It wasn't just the knowledge that scared her, it was the truth of what they could become if they weren't careful. And that truth seemed to lurk in the shadows of the halls, ready to consume them. The guardian, who had always accompanied them, took a step closer. "You have now obtained the key to knowledge, but it is no simple gift. The key is not just a means to understanding, it is also a curse. The path before you is lined with your own decisions. What you choose will decide the fate of the world and of yourselves." "What are we supposed to do?" Kale asked, a mix of anger and despair in his voice. "How can we do anything when the price is so high?" "There is no choice left," the guardian replied, his words as firm as a rock. "The world will continue to turn, whether you're ready or not. The true curse of knowledge is not what you see, but what you cannot change once it has been revealed." The torn path. Kale and Illa stood before another gate, this one much larger, much more powerful than the previous ones. It was made of pure, glowing gold, and adorned with ancient symbols that seemed to come alive. It was the entrance to another room, the room of decisions. But this room had a very clear meaning. Only one of them would be able to continue the journey. The other would be left behind. What is this?" Illa asked, her voice little more than a whisper. The tension between them was palpable as they gazed at the gate. They knew that the moment that could separate them was approaching. Only one of them could enter the next level of knowledge. The other would remain forever trapped in the halls of Lyria. "It is the true test," the guardian said. "Only the strongest can enter the next stage. Only the one who can fully accept the curse of knowledge may continue. The other will be left behind. Forever." "And what happens to the one who is left behind?" Kale asked, his voice hollow. He knew this was no simple decision. This choice would change the course of their lives forever. "He will be forgotten. No one will remember him. He will turn to dust, a shadow in a world that never knew him. Knowledge is a delicate web, Kale. There is no place for weakness. Either you are strong enough, or you are lost." The battle of the soul. A heavy breath escaped Cale's lips as he processed the meaning of the Guardian's words. He couldn't believe that the Guardian spoke of this choice so easily. The halls that had once felt like home now felt like a prison, a trap waiting to crush him. The truth was cruel. Illa stepped forward. Maybe we shouldn't have to make this choice, Cale. Maybe there's still a way to avoid this. Maybe we can continue together. There is no way back, Cale replied, his gaze fixed on the Golden Gate. We've all learned that. This truth, it's final. We must face what lies before us. Illa looked into his eyes. In that moment, everything she had ever known was at stake. But it wasn't just their future that was on the line. It was the fate of a world that had long been sinking into the fog of darkness. Cale, I will never turn my back on you, Illa whispered. Her words were calm, but in her eyes burned the fire of a long-hidden will. Not now, not here. You gave me life. You saved me. I will not ask you to make the same choice. Cale took a deep breath and closed his eyes. The decision was not easy, but it was necessary. The truth that lay before him was like a sword piercing his heart, but he knew there was only one way to survive, to sacrifice himself for the greater good. I'll go, he said, his voice firm. I will go alone. The victim. Illa stared at him as he turned away from her and entered the gate. You're leaving? Her voice was barely a whisper. I have to, Cale said, stepping through the Golden Gate that closed behind him. The space beyond him seemed bathed in light, but the light had a dark, painful glow. It felt like a part of him was forever lost. But as the archway closed behind him, he heard Illa scream. Her scream was the last memory of what they had shared. Chapter 14. The Final Trial. The darkness in Cale's heart had only intensified since then. The Golden Gate that had closed behind him wasn't just a passage. It was a lock, sealing his connection to the world, to Illa, and everything he had ever known. Cale now stood in a space of pure nothingness, broken only by a single beam of light that emanated from an ancient glowing scroll. It hovered as though held by invisible hands, and from it spoke a voice, deep and heavy, shaking Cale's soul. Welcome, Cale. You are the chosen one, the one who can gain knowledge denied to all others. But this knowledge has its price. Will you pay this price, or will you turn back? Cale felt cold sweat on his forehead. I have no choice, he muttered. I've already lost everything. What's the price I have to pay? The voice from the scroll laughed softly, a high, ominous laugh that echoed through the space. The price is not what you think. It's not about your body or your mind. It's about your legacy, your soul, what you've become. The darkness that surrounds you now is your true inheritance. You cannot shed it. It will always be a part of you. I don't understand, Cale whispered. What does that mean for me? It means you must make a decision that will not only determine your life. You are the intersection between light and shadow. Your choice will shape the future of the world. You can embrace the darkness and rule over knowledge, or you can choose the light and lead the world into a new era of peace. But no matter what you choose, you will never again be the same Cale. The space around Cale began to warp. The walls seemed to breathe, as if the room itself was a living being, connected to the choices he would make. It was a place of utter silence, broken only by the threatening voice of the scroll. I have no choice, do I? Cale's voice was weak as he stared into the darkness. It's not about what I want, but what I'm forced to do. Exactly, the voice replied. But the true price is that you will never again believe in the world you once knew. The knowledge will change you. You will see what others cannot see. And you will know that you are the only one who can shape destiny. Cale took one last look at the glowing scroll now in his hand. Its light flickered in a moment of doubt, and then with a swift movement he opened the scroll and read the words that would forever be etched in his mind. Your legacy is the curse of knowledge. You are the bringer of change, the destroyer and the creator. The oath of knowledge. As the words echoed in Cale's mind, he began to understand. The scroll was more than just a vessel of knowledge. It was a symbol of the true burden he now carried. The darkness was no mere shadow. It was a part of him, an inheritance that left him no choice. But just as he grasped the full meaning of the words, a loud crack sounded behind him. The space began to sway, the walls collapsing as if the very fabric of reality itself was in danger. Cale sprang to his feet, clutching the scroll as he knew the end was near. You have gained the knowledge, echoed the voice of the scroll. But the price you must pay is unimaginable. The curse of knowledge is now complete. The darkness will consume you. Suddenly, Cale felt a tremendous power rising within him, a force that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. The space around him collapsed as the darkness of the world merged with the darkness within him. But he resisted. With every fiber of his being, he fought against the pull of the darkness that sought to swallow him whole. In that moment, he knew he was more than just a tool of fate. He was the key to a new era, or the destroyer of the world he knew. The final step. Cale looked at the shattered halls of Lyria, a symbol of everything he left behind. But it wasn't the end. He knew his journey was far from over. Whatever was written in the scroll, it was only the beginning of an even greater trial. I have no choice, Cale murmured to himself once again as he faced the darkness. But I will not let this darkness control me. I will shape the fate of the world with my own hands.